if you were a company basically that was doing business kind of anywhere outside the US and having to import goods in any capacity, this was a risk area. And it might have been a risk area that you hadn't thought of.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox along with Mike DeBernardis, partner from Hughes Hubbard, for the inaugural episode of the Corruption Files. Over this podcast series, we're going to take a look at some key FCPA and broader anti-corruption cases and see if we can mine them for what they meant at the time, what they mean now, and what they may mean down the road. So, Mike, first of all, welcome, and I'm thrilled to be able to do this series with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tom. I'm very excited for the inaugural episode.
So in this first episode, we're going to take a look at energy cases that were FCPA violations. And we're going to start with what I or others called FCPA Settlement Day. And that was what the FCPA blog called Making FCPA History, when the Department of Justice and Securities and Exchange Commission announced settlements with 6 energy companies and 1 transportation company for Panalpina Settlement Day. And on Panalpina Settlement Day, we had settlements with Panalpina, a transportation company, and then the following energy companies: Shell, Transocean, Pride International, Tidewater, and Noble, to the tune of $156.5 million total fines and penalties and $73 million in civil disgorgement. This amount does not seem as high now as some of the subsequent cases we're going to talk about, but it was a massive groundswell of FCPA cases. And it was really the first time we had seen the Department of Justice move through an industry. If I could give a little background to this case, it really started when General Electric was going to buy a company called Vetco Gray. And in doing their pre-acquisition due diligence, they discovered that Vetco Gray had some suspicious payments for shipping equipment in Nigeria. So they told Vetco Gray, go investigate this, clean it up, and then come back to us and we'll look at some sort of M&A deal. Vetco Gray did so, self-disclosed to the U.S. government, received a fine and penalty, but someone in the Department of Justice FCPA unit got the bright idea. Well, if Panalpina is doing this for one energy company or energy service company in Nigeria, maybe they're doing it for others. And lo and behold, they were doing it for a lot of other companies. And what they were doing is paying bribes to get equipment into Nigeria. So all of these cases revolved around that one set of facts, and it gave the DOJ a blueprint to look at these other energy companies and bring these 7 settlements on Panalpina Settlement Day. I can't really emphasize enough what this meant. This was 2010. At that point, it was some of the biggest fines we'd ever seen, but it really sent shockwaves through the energy industry, the compliance community, and the white-collar defense bar. So, Mike, with that introduction, what really did you see around Panalpina Settlement Day from the prosecutorial perspective, or that you used to counsel your clients of what they needed to start looking at internally at that point in time?
Yeah, it's always fun, I think, Tom, to kind of go back and put yourself back in, especially when we're going back now to 2010, right? Put yourself back in the shoes from then. You really, I think, touched on it on the key piece from a prosecutorial perspective for this case, which is that whoever it was, whether it was one person or a group, who had the bright idea to say, well, wait a second, if Panalpina was doing this for Vetco Gray, they have all of these other clients that we know about. And Panalpina World Transport was a large publicly traded company who had a very nice client list. Maybe they're doing it for others, and they're working with those companies in Nigeria. So let's look into that. And I think that really unlocked a formula that the DOJ has gone back to. To me, it's slightly different than an industry sweep. that we have talked about in the past, and we'll talk about again, I'm sure. This was more of a hub and spoke type arrangement, right? Where they found the hub being Panalpina and said, let's check out the other spokes. And you'll see this sometimes later on. We've seen it with when they found a company who used a particular agent to pay bribes, and then they realized that agent has worked with other large companies and or organizing their investigation that way. But it was a really effective formula. I mean, this case, when it was announced, you're absolutely right. It sort of the timing of it for where we were with FCPA enforcement. This was such huge news for such a long time and it was really this formula that was the center of it. It also it planted the seeds, I think, for what ultimately became the pilot program and then the corporate enforcement policy. Right around this time is when you really started to hear officials talk about, voluntary disclosure, and during conferences, they really tried to encourage companies to disclose matters voluntarily, and said that, the department would really look at that favorably. But up until this point, it was really hard, if you looked at various settlements, to figure out what the real benefit was, to compare cases. But here we had, what was it in total? Seven or eight resolutions at the same time. Some of the companies disclosed the matters voluntarily, others didn't. Now we can quibble about what voluntary disclosure was when the DOJ really had started to investigate this hub and spoke structure already, but and we could sort of compare apples to apples about how they were treated and everything else. So it really, from this point forward, it seemed that the department started to be more deliberate in terms of, in announcing the settlements, kind of being clear about what they were giving credit for and how important disclosure and cooperation was. And then I remember this distinctly as I was working at the time, counseling a company in the oil and gas industry, and not just for that client, but for others. Almost overnight, interactions with customs officials became a huge area of concern. Not that it wasn't before, but because there hadn't been any major action in that space previously, that was just considered lower risk than a contracting official, or even some of these permits and licensing processes. And so almost overnight, we had clients kind of come knocking about, what do we do with customs? How do we work this out? What sort of controls do we need in place? And I'm having trouble in my mind thinking of another situation like this, right? Where with one fell swoop, whole industries started thinking differently about a particular process than they had the night before.
So it's interesting you bring up the customs angle, because as we look back over now somewhat 15 years, perhaps even longer, retrospect of the bribery and corruption leading up to the enforcement actions, it's abundantly clear that bribery and corruption was going on. To the point with Panalpina, the special service, they called it, was the Black Express service. And they would literally wrap oilfield tools and parts in black plastic and fly it in on black planes at night. But it didn't stop there, because in the billing was a flat $25,000 per shipment. And so this was pretty low-hanging fruit, but it also made people realize you have to look at a variety of different aspects. Obviously, due diligence has always been high, or it should have been high, but now you needed to look at your books and records. Now you needed to look at your payments. And now you needed to look at, well, how is that shipping service done? A shipping company executive once gave a talk where he said, if you look at the success rates of getting equipment into a country, if you have a vendor with 100% success rate, you have a problem. because no one has 100% success rate. And that really struck me and has always stuck with me, that you have to look at so many different data points now. And this was really the first time I think people had thought about looking beyond, well, what's our agent doing for us? And that, because of the really low-hanging nature of what was going on, made part of this so dramatic. But the other point you raised I found was really interesting. You see the beginnings, or at least the intellectual underpinnings of the pilot program, which led to the FCPA corporate enforcement policy as far back as Panalpina Settlement Day. And we had, even on Panalpina Settlement Day, one of the energy companies, Noble, got an NPA. They didn't even get a DPA. And so clearly the department was communicating to us. It was somewhat difficult to read the tea leaves back then, and perhaps they had not thought through the direction they were going. But you began to see, and will become a little bit more clear as we go through this series, how the responses of companies actually led to some pretty significant reductions in fines and penalties and the overall approach of the Department of Justice. But this case really sort of broke the dam open. And the department now, as you said, figured out, let's look at customer lists. Let's look at the suppliers who may not have been third-party agents. And let's look at some different information that is in the books and records that has to be certified to under Sarbanes-Oxley, that we can data mine to see if anything nefarious or askance is going on. One other thing about this case that directly impacted Panalpina was the following. 25% of their top-line revenue came from shipping equipment into Africa. They were a Swiss company, publicly traded in the United States, and they were viewed by many American companies, particularly energy companies headquartered in the United States, as a safe bet and a safe choice because they were a Swiss company and because they did show up well in due diligence reports. And so companies, I think, began to realize that due diligence was not a one-time exercise, but really a process, number one. But number two, if your business model is based on bribery and corruption, and that bribery and corruption ends, it's going to very negatively impact your business model. Now, that could be a company that has direct contracts they've obtained through bribery and corruption. But here, Panalpina, it was almost indirect because their business model was billing others for their own bribery and corruption. And frankly, Panalpina never recovered. They are no longer one of the world's top transport companies, although they still exist. And I think they are run in compliance now, and people have confidence in them. But they really never recovered from this. And so it also demonstrated how the negative impact of bribery and corruption can be. And that was one of the things that the Department of Justice talked about in the first edition of the FCPA Resource Guide, which was, if you business model is based on this and you take that business away, whether you take it away in terms of a M&A deal that's gone south, a business venture, either a joint venture partner or other business venture that you have to jettison, it can be a real cost much beyond simply the fine and penalty. So I still remember this day in this case. It really was the first sort of major group of cases. Obviously, we had Siemens before this, but that was seen almost as an outlier from 2008. And this day really, I think, still resonates today for the reasons that we've talked about so far.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that you just mentioned, I think, is worth kind of highlighting more is, at this time, I don't want to speak in absolutes too much, but you had Panalpina, and then the alternative to that, especially in Africa, were often these local companies with very opaque backgrounds or a lack of a track record. And so, as you said, Panalpina was looked at as sort of the safest bet, right? Let's go with sort of the highest profile option, who has this long track record of experience and this long list of clients that our peers are using as well. And I don't, I can't say this for certain, but I imagine in that scenario that the level of due diligence applied was not as significant, certainly not as significant as what's going to be expected today, but even in the standards of the 2008, 2009 timeframe. And you had this situation where, if you run a Dun and Bradstreet report on Panalpina, it would show up fine. But one of the other noteworthy things here is that the energy companies knew, right? It wasn't a secret to the energy companies about how Panalpina was doing this, especially in some of the higher risk jurisdictions, in Nigeria in particular, which was highlighted in most of the settlements. That they were perfectly aware what intervention payments meant and what I can't remember the name of Panalpina had a whole service, right? A whole service that was designed basically to circumvent Nigerian customs. And so, it's the front end due diligence. And then, as you mentioned, also sort of that monitoring that really at the time, everything is different when you look at it in hindsight. I would say that monitoring, especially these types of third parties at the time, wasn't all that common, right? If you had a diligence process in place and they completed it, they sort of went about their business and you thought that was good enough. And this was a clear example of why it wasn't.
And you're absolutely right. There's 5 steps in the third-party risk management process: a business justification, a questionnaire, due diligence. Based on the questionnaire, evaluation, and contract terms and conditions, then you sign the contract. Well, now you have the contract in place, but you're only at the starting point in my mind because you have to manage that relationship. And it really put that 5th step front and center, that many companies did not have audit rights. And if they had them, they did not exercise those audit rights. And that due diligence really is an ongoing process. The other thing that struck me about this case was we knew about high-risk jurisdictions and high-risk geographic areas previously. Trace International has released their Corruption Perception Index for many years. But I think it also drove home the basic message that there are high-risk geographic areas and they are not unknown. And you need to focus on your business interests, whatever they may be, in those high-risk geographic areas, and you may need to do that first. So we began to get a bit more of a risk-based approach, this time using either jurisdictions or geographic areas, and I think that's something that's stayed with us till this day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think it's even more specific than that. Not just high-risk jurisdictions, but high-risk jurisdictions for particular transactions. So I'm not picking on Nigeria. It was just happened to be the central part of these cases. But the customs process in Nigeria, even at the time, was known to be very difficult. It was known to also be very to lack a certain transparency. So it was a very high risk area, and Nigeria overall was a high risk jurisdiction, but the customs process in particular lacked the controls that you might want to see to sort of manage some of the corruption risk, and really, I think these companies probably didn't address that the way that they would be expected to be, right? Even if they hired a publicly traded customs clearance company that had a long list of high profile clients, more was required. That became really abundantly clear.
So this case really, I think, was not so much a precursor. It was really the start. We'd had the sort of modern era of FCPA enforcement. Some date that from 2004 forward or 2007 forward, certainly with Siemens. But this what seemed to be the first one where we had a lot of companies, all very high-profile companies, announced in a way that I think everyone went, wow, we better start paying attention now. And I'd like to maybe end this episode, Mike, by asking, with your colleagues at Hughes Hubbard and your client base at the time, were you really able to communicate the sort of wow nature of this? And this is significant, and we either need to do things differently or at least look at what we're doing to see if we have a problem?
Absolutely. And I really think there's two pieces, two sides of that for our clients in the oil and gas industry. It was unmistakable. I mean, the not just the settlement, but Panalpina, if I'm not mistaken, they shut down their operations in Nigeria. I mean, the waves in the industry, you couldn't avoid it. It was remarkable, and like I said, almost overnight, that industry, we had clients looking for different solutions. Now they're looking for different solutions, and the one that they thought was the most reputable turns out it's got all these issues, and so you're sort of going down to the next rung and realizing we have to do really enhanced due diligence on these types of third parties. So that was in the oil and gas industry. There was no mistaking it. Even outside of the oil and gas industry, because of the names involved, because of the number of companies kind of being hit in one shot, and because of the nature with the customs clearance process, where if you were a company basically that was doing business kind of anywhere outside the U.S. And having to import goods in any capacity, this was a risk area. And it might have been a risk area that you hadn't thought of. And that's a really much easier message to convey, and one that strikes home, I think, to clients more than trying to take, some small fact pattern in a larger FCPA case and apply it to the company's business. This was something that most of our clients were dealing with on a daily basis and perhaps weren't recognizing the associated risks.
So I'd like to end with something that I thought was a very positive outcome from Panalpina Settlement Day, particularly in the energy industry, but in a way that spoke across different industries. And it was the following. And I observed this, and I was a part of this, which was the energy industry's business solution was obviously not to stop doing business in high-risk jurisdictions, but to share that risk and to share that solution. And what I mean by that is if you were doing business with any of the major oilfield service companies in West Africa or Nigeria, you had to have a compliance program in place. Then it became, if you were doing business with an energy company, you had to have a compliance program in place. And it wasn't just that you had a program in place. They would come look at your program and they would audit your program before they signed a contract. So the business solution was, in the energy industry, for the industry to start requiring compliance programs literally up and down the chain. And I give this example because I was involved in it. I had a client who was a $15 million software company, and they had one piece of software that did something downhole, and they were too small to have their own sales force, so they had sales agents. And I told them that if they didn't have a compliance program in place, that they would get no investment dollars and they'd probably get no contracts. Well, one of the major oilfield service companies 2 weeks later came after I'd been able to put a program in place, and they wanted to look at the third-party due diligence, and we had it, and we had done it. And that drove home to me, everyone was looking at this up and down the chain. I don't mean to suggest it stopped all bribery and corruption in energy, but it was a first step towards making companies do business in compliance with a more robust nature. And that was not driven by the government, although it was driven by the regulatory enforcement of Panalpina Settlement Day. And we've seen that in several other industries now. So that was a outcome that I thought really demonstrated that there is a business solution to compliance, and it's to do business with other companies that do business in compliance. So it seemed to me to be at least a positive net coming out of all this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's well said, and I certainly saw at the time and still see today the effects of that, sort of this first instance of an industry really I don't want to say taking it upon themselves, but starting to put these standards in place that aren't perfect, but one of the even though they're not perfect, one of the things that those types of steps do is that it normalizes compliance programs, it normalizes due diligence for everybody involved. So I think that's a really good point.
So, Mike, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I hope our listeners will join us in our next episode where we're going to take up the pharma industry.
Thanks, Tom.